They called me a burden on the same day the power got cut because I stopped paying for it. But here's the truth they'll never admit. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why silence can be louder than sacrifice. There's a kind of silence that doesn't soothe, it stalks. It slithers beneath the cracks of a locked door and presses against your chest like the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. I stood there that night, barefoot heart thudding like a drum trapped in a cage, as my father Walter pounded his fists on the other side of Rachel's apartment door. "Claire," he bellowed, voice cracked with rage and alcohol. "You think you can just walk away?" I didn't move. Rachel stood behind me, tense and pale, one hand clenched around her phone, the other hovering over the deadbolt. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Outside, his shouts ricocheted down the hallway, an ugly soundtrack to what used to be my life. What happened to get us here? Why was a 60-year-old man, once a respected engineer, now reduced to screaming threats at his daughter through the hallway of someone else's home? The answer began on a night painted in tinsel and tension. Just 3 weeks earlier, it was Christmas Eve, the kind of night where neighbors lit their porches with flickering reindeer and old Bing Crosby songs floated through the air like ghosts of gentler times. I'd just returned from work, my coat still clung to the scent of burnt coffee and office printer toner. The house smelled faintly of ham, something my mother Susan had likely reheated from the freezer. The Christmas tree leaned slightly to the left, its plastic needles aged and drooping under ornaments that hadn't moved from their hooks in years. Walter sat at the head of the table like a sunken king staring into his wineglass as if it might offer him redemption. Eli, my 17-year-old brother, glanced at me with a smile that barely touched his tired eyes. We all knew something was wrong. We'd known it for years. Dinner was silent, save for the scrape of utensils and the soft croon of holiday music from the kitchen radio. I'd just passed the mashed potatoes when it happened. Walter slammed his knife onto the table. The clatter made my hands jerk, and the silence that followed was absolute. "You're a burden," he said, not even flinching. "You can't stay here anymore." My mother let out a laugh, a strange dry noise like a cough trying to hide in a chuckle. But he didn't smile. His eyes, once so sharp with intellect, were dulled by years of bitterness and pride. They locked onto mine, unwavering. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Eli froze with a fork halfway to his mouth. "What did you just say?" I asked, finally my voice quieter than I expected. "You heard me," Walter replied. "You've stayed long enough. This is my house, and I'm done carrying your dead weight." Dead weight. The irony stung more than the insult. For 4 years, I'd covered every major bill: electricity, water, internet, even the heater last winter that would have quit mid-December if not for my paycheck. Walter had lost his job 3 years ago and never bothered to find another. Susan worked part-time at the library, mostly for the health insurance. I'd stayed, not because I couldn't afford to leave, but because if I left, they'd collapse. And now I was the burden. Eli looked between them, stunned. If they can kick her out this easy, who's next? My mother said nothing. Walter straightened in his seat like a man reclaiming control of his kingdom. "I've made my decision," he said. "Diane." He still called my mother by name when he wanted to shut her up. The room felt colder than the snowless Ohio night outside. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. If this was their choice, I would honor it. Quietly. I pushed my plate aside and stood up. The only person I looked at was Eli. He was the last tether I had to this house and the only one worth saving. I walked upstairs, my footsteps soft but steady, and closed my bedroom door behind me. The creak of the hinges sounded like a funeral march. I didn't pack out of anger. I packed because staying had become a form of slow self-erasure. The wallpaper in that room still bore the pencil marks from when I was 5 learning to count. Now, all I saw were reminders of how much I had sacrificed to keep everyone else afloat, and none of it mattered. By the time I zipped up my suitcase, I'd made a vow, not one of vengeance, but of finality. If they wanted me gone, I would go. But they'd better be prepared for the cold that comes when you cut off your own lifeline. The smell of reheated ham lingered like an afterthought. The tree stood awkwardly in the corner, wrapped in faded string lights that flickered more out of obligation than cheer. Our house never looked like the ones in holiday commercials. No roaring fireplaces, no warm laughter echoing off polished floors. Just a peeling wall, an old radio murmuring carols, and a family clinging to a script that no longer made sense. I sat at the table still in my coat. The chill outside hadn't left me, and neither had the one inside. Walter was at the head of the table, swirling wine in a chipped glass like he was starring in his own tragedy. My mother passed the potatoes without looking up, and Eli, bless his gentle heart, tried to make eye contact with me, his brows lifted in silent encouragement. It didn't work. Every bite felt like sand. No one spoke. The silence was too perfect, like the quiet in a forest just before the storm breaks. Then came the sound. Walter's knife crashed onto the table with a metallic thud that startled even the radio into skipping a beat. My hand jerked, and the edge of my fork clanged against the plate. "Claire," he said, not raising his voice, but anchoring it with something worse finality. "You're a burden, and you can't live here anymore." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They simply sat in the center of the room like a broken ornament no one wanted to pick up. I blinked. Once? Twice. Surely I'd misheard. A piece of potato slid from my fork back onto the plate. Across the table, my mother let out a brittle laugh the kind people make when they hope something is a joke. But Walter didn't smile. He leaned forward, voice low and smooth, like oil over fire. "You've overstayed. It's time you take care of yourself elsewhere." I opened my mouth, then closed it. The only sound was the faint hum of Silent Night from the radio. The irony burned. "I've been paying the bills," I finally said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The electric, the internet, the water. The heater, last winter," Walter shrugged, already looking past me. "I didn't ask you to." "No, but you sure didn't stop me when the house stayed warm while you watched TV all day." My mother's fork paused midair. Still, she said nothing. "Enough," Walter said, waving one hand as if dismissing a waiter. "This is my house, and I want peace in it." Eli stood eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, what are you doing? I'm restoring order," Walter snapped. "It's about time. You mean kicking out the only person keeping us afloat?" Eli's voice cracked. "She's done everything. How can you just stay out of this?" Walter said. But Eli didn't sit down. He turned to me, voice shaking. "Claire, you don't have to go. He doesn't mean it." "Do you, Dad? You don't mean it, right?" Walter didn't answer. That was answer enough. I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my gaze. Her eyes stayed fixed on her plate like if she just ignored it all, it would go away. My hands trembled, but I kept them in my lap. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat and stood. "I won't stay where I'm not wanted," I said softly. "You've made yourself clear." Eli reached out, but I stepped back. Walter exhaled like he'd just won a battle, the faint smirk curling at the edge of his lips. "That's for the best." The lights from the Christmas tree blinked lazily in the corner, casting cold reflections on the window. It was supposed to be a season of warmth, but all I felt was frost clawing at the edges of my resolve. "I'm going to pack," I said. No one moved. No one stopped me. I walked away from the table, leaving my half-eaten dinner and 4 years of sacrifice behind. The floorboards creaked under my steps like they, too, were tired of holding things up. When I reached the stairs, I heard Eli's voice behind me. "Claire." I turned. His face was flushed with anger and hurt. "They don't deserve you," he whispered. I nodded, the lump in my throat finally dissolving into something I couldn't name. I didn't cry. Not there, not in front of them, but as I climbed the stairs, a part of me cracked. Not because I was being kicked out, but because it didn't even shock me. I'd always known I was the scaffolding holding this family up. But tonight, I realized they never once thought about what would happen if the scaffolding walked away. At the top of the stairs, I looked down. The trees' lights still blinked, blue, red, green, but they gave off no warmth, no comfort, just hollow beauty, just like this family. The suitcase thudded onto the floor like a gavel. Final. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, a sweatshirt folded neatly across her lap, her fingers brushing over the threads as if they could offer comfort. They didn't. The room, which had once cocooned her from high school heartbreaks and young adult confusion, now felt like a hollow shell, echoing with the absence of belonging. She didn't pack in a fury. There was no rush. Every motion was deliberate, like sealing a letter you know you'll never send. Sweaters, notebooks, a small jewelry box her grandmother had once given her, each placed with care into the suitcase. Her mother's muffled voice filtered through the floorboards. Claire didn't stop to listen. Not anymore. By the time her clothes were packed, the moon had risen, casting silver lines across the wooden floor. Claire stood and walked to her desk. She pulled open the bottom drawer and retrieved a worn envelope. Inside were the bills: electricity, water, internet, all registered in her name, all auto-paid from her account, all taken for granted. She turned on her laptop and began. Click. Remove bank info from the utility portal. Click. Cancel autopay. Click. Close the secondary credit card she'd opened for Susan. The screen flashed with warnings. Are you sure you want to remove this payment method? Future bills will not be paid. Yes, she was sure. She leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. There was no vindictiveness in her chest, no burning need for revenge, just a quiet sense of closure. She hadn't needed to shout, threaten, or plead. She'd warned them with her constancy, with every late-night shift that kept the lights on every grocery run they didn't thank her for. Her presence had been the silent alarm, and they never heard it. Now they would hear her absence. Claire stood and walked to the bathroom. As she reached for her toothbrush, her gaze caught the mirror. She froze. The woman staring back wasn't someone she recognized. Not because of the tired eyes or the faint crease between her brows. Those had been there for years. It was the softness, the clarity. For the first time in ages, Claire saw herself without the weight of obligation distorting the reflection. She placed a hand on the counter to steady herself. A whisper slipped from her lips, unplanned. There you are. It wasn't about anger. It was about identity, about reclaiming the version of herself that had slowly been chipped away by years of being needed, but never seen. She turned off the light, letting the darkness embrace her one last time. Downstairs, she wheeled her suitcase past the living room. The television still flickered. Neither parent looked up. No one stopped her. No goodbyes. Just the sound of the door opening, the cold wind curling around her like a promise. In the car, she sat for a moment before turning the key. Her breath fogged the window, but her hands were steady. She took out her phone and texted Eli. Leaving now. I love you. He replied within seconds. I'm proud of you. They'll feel it. Not the money, the silence. She smiled. Yes, they would. She drove off into the night, not chasing freedom, but arriving at it. Rachel's apartment was a second-story walk-up above a bakery that smelled like fresh cinnamon bread every morning. The floors creaked. The heating rattled. The windows let in too much wind. But to Claire, it felt like the softest place she'd landed in years. She didn't say much in those first few days. Neither did Rachel. Their friendship didn't rely on noise or explanation. It moved in gestures, tea steeped, without asking an extra blanket folded on the couch, a post-it that said, "Take your time." Claire slept on the pullout. Her suitcase remained half open in the corner, clothes still folded, like she might need to flee again. But as the week passed, she started to unpack not just her belongings, but the parts of herself she hadn't seen in years. Each morning, she sat by the window with a notebook and a mug of coffee. She didn't journal. She strategized. A new checking account, a savings goal, credit cards in her own name only, an email purge, a vision board, though she kept that part in her head. The first night she went to sleep without checking her phone for her mother's texts, she dreamed of waves lapping against a quiet shore. In the dream, she was alone and peaceful. Rachel left for work each day with a wink and a smile. "Don't worry about groceries," she'd say. "You paid for the heat in that house for 4 years. Let someone feed you now." And Claire let her. Not out of laziness, but in reverence for the stillness that healing required. There's a fatigue that doesn't come from the body. It grows from the soul when you've been needed too long by people who only notice you when you stop. Some nights they watched movies under wool blankets and laughed like teenagers. Claire learned to laugh again, though it came awkwardly at first, like stretching a limb that had been cast in plaster too long. She sometimes cried after alone in the bathroom, overwhelmed not by sadness, but by the unfamiliar texture of joy. But it wasn't all peace. Each day that passed, a thread of unease tugged at the back of her mind, not loud, not constant, just a whisper, a reminder. They would feel it. She hadn't heard from her father, and that absence made her more nervous than his anger ever had. Susan had called twice. Claire hadn't answered. Eli had texted once saying things were tense, but not elaborating. On the 8th morning, her phone buzzed just after she poured milk into her coffee. Missed call. Mom. Missed call. Mom. Text Eli. Claire, something's wrong. Her breath caught. Eli. Power's out. Dad's yelling. Internet's down. What happened? Claire stared at the screen for a long moment. The edges of the phone felt hot in her palm. A call came in. She answered. Claire. Her mother's voice was shrill, brittle. Everything's off. The power, the internet, the heater won't turn on. And your father he's furious. What's happening? Did you do something? Claire exhaled, calm and even. I just stopped paying for a house I don't live in, she said. A beat of silence. Then another. And then click. The line went dead. Claire lowered the phone to the table. Her hand didn't tremble. Rachel walked in from the hallway, toothbrush in her mouth, pausing when she saw Claire's face. Everything okay? Claire nodded slowly. The lights are out, she said, in more ways than one. She looked down at her coffee and took a sip. Still warm. Still hers. The piece hadn't shattered. It had simply shifted. Now it had sharper edges, but it was still hers to hold. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready to keep it. Even if the storm came knocking, even if the past clawed back, she was no longer in that house. She was no longer on their leash. And the silence they used to ignore was now roaring in their ears. The first sign came quietly. Claire was reviewing her budget when a security alert popped up on her phone. Suspicious login attempt detected. The IP address listed was from Ohio, her old neighborhood. Her stomach didn't drop. Her hands didn't shake. But she did pause. Then she opened her laptop and began locking every gate she'd once left cracked open. Her old savings account frozen. Emergency contacts cleared. Bank logins secured with new credentials. Shared email recovery options deleted. He was trying to reach her not through words, but through systems. The same man who had refused to say thank you was now attempting to crawl back in through digital back doors. Claire didn't react with fear. She reacted with finality. She contacted her bank's fraud department, updated every form of ID, and added verbal passwords only she would remember. Still, there was no doubt in her mind this wasn't random. This was personal, and it was just beginning. 3 days later, she received a call from the bank's security team. Someone attempted to impersonate you over the phone, they said. They knew your full name, date of birth, even your childhood dog's name. Claire exhaled. Thank you for flagging it, she replied calmly. Please note on the record, I do not give access to anyone, especially not my father. The silence on the other end was brief but heavy. She hung up, and for the first time in weeks, she double-locked the apartment door that night. Rachel noticed. He's escalating, she said gently. Do you think he'd come here? Claire didn't answer. She didn't have to. 2 nights later, he did. It was just past 10 when the knocking started, furious, uneven, the kind of banging meant to threaten, not announce. Claire was the first to rise. Rachel peeked out from the kitchen, her phone already in hand. Claire didn't hesitate. She walked calmly to the door and looked through the peephole. Walter. His face was red eyes, glassy, and rimmed with rage. His hair was uncombed, his coat half open in the cold hallway air. He was shouting already. Claire, I know you're in there. You can't just disappear. You can't do this to your family. Claire said nothing. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She just watched him. He pounded on the door again. You've... Behind her. Rachel's voice was tight. I'm calling the police. Do it, Claire whispered. Not with fear, but with certainty. Walter continued ranting. You think you're better than us after everything we did for you. Claire tilted her head slightly. The only thing she allowed herself to feel was clarity. This wasn't a father reclaiming a daughter. This was a man denied control. From the peephole, she watched his face twist and redden. His fists go limp when he realized no one would open the door. Then came the sirens. The red and blue lights danced down the hallway before he heard them. When he turned his head and saw what was coming, something in him deflated. He didn't fight when the officers arrived, didn't plead, didn't apologize. He just let them lead him down the stairs and out into the night. Rachel finally exhaled. Claire didn't. Instead, she stood at the now quiet door for a long moment. Then she slowly opened it, stepped out onto the threshold, and stared into the empty hallway. She wasn't checking for danger. She was acknowledging its absence. Inside, Rachel hovered, unsure. Claire turned to her steady. "He thought I just walked away," she said. "But I built a wall, a damn strong one." Rachel nodded slowly. Claire walked back inside and shut the door, with finality not to hide, but to claim the peace she'd earned. Claire first noticed something was off when she couldn't find her car keys. She kept them in a small ceramic dish by the apartment door always. It was a habit formed out of necessity during her chaotic years at home. Consistency had been her only anchor. She checked the coat pockets, the kitchen counter, even under the couch cushions. Nothing. "Did I leave them in my bag?" she muttered, rifling through the tote she carried everywhere. But even as she searched, a darker suspicion took root. She opened the app, linked to her car's GPS tracker. Her breath caught. The car wasn't in the apartment parking lot. It was in a neighborhood 10 miles away, one she hadn't driven to in weeks. Rachel walked in carrying groceries and paused at Claire's expression. "What happened?" "My car," Claire said quietly. "It's gone." They drove together in Rachel's old sedan. The silence in the car was taut, like a rope pulled too tight. When they reached the location, Claire's heart sank. There, parked awkwardly in front of a pharmacy, was her car, and inside, behind the wheel engine off, was her mother. Susan. Claire parked, walked up to the car window and knocked. Her mother flinched before rolling it down slowly. "Oh," Susan said, attempting a thin smile. "Claire." Claire's voice was flat. "What are you doing with my car? I just needed it for a quick errand. Your father's medication, he ran out, and I couldn't afford the delivery fee. You took it without asking," Claire said. "That's theft." Susan scoffed, glancing away. "Don't be dramatic. It's not like I was selling it." Claire narrowed her eyes. "No, you were busy selling something else." Susan froze. Claire reached into her bag and held up the receipt from the pawnshop. "My laptop. Gone. Sold last week. You used my driver's license that I left behind in a drawer." The silence between them turned jagged. Claire's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "I kept that laptop for work, for everything I built after leaving, and you sold it for what rent? Another bottle of wine for him. You broke into Rachel's apartment to get it, didn't you?" Susan's lips pressed into a line. "You have no idea what it's like, Claire. He's sick. I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Claire whispered. Susan looked up, eyes pleading. "I'm your mother. I gave you everything you gave me." "Guilt," Claire cut in. "You stood by while he tore me down, and now you've become him." A shadow passed over Susan's face. "I was desperate," she muttered. "So was I." "For years," Claire replied, "but I never took from you." They stood there in silence, Claire's hands clenched at her sides, Susan shrinking behind the steering wheel. Then Claire pulled out her phone. "What are you doing?" Susan asked, a tremor creeping into her voice. "Calling the police." "Claire, I gave you chances. I left quietly. I didn't demand anything. But this," she looked at the car, then at her mother. "This is betrayal. You wouldn't," Susan said, barely a whisper, but Claire already had the phone to her ear. When the police arrived, Susan tried to explain to soften the story with half-truths and maternal tones. But Claire remained still. She handed over the pawn receipt, explained the missing laptop, confirmed the unauthorized use of her vehicle. The officers were professional, almost detached. "She's my daughter," Susan pleaded. "She's just upset." Claire looked at her, then not with anger, but with something deeper. Sadness. Because even now, Susan didn't understand. "You didn't just steal from me," Claire said. You stole from the only peace I've ever known." That night, Rachel made tea, but Claire didn't drink it. She sat by the window, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the city blur into night. She was always quiet, she finally said, always cleaning up after his messes. I thought that meant she was kind, but it just meant she'd rather disappear than confront him. Rachel sat beside her. And now she's become the mess. Claire didn't nod. She just stared out the window, eyes dry, voice low. Not everyone who survives is innocent. Some just get better at pretending. Rachel didn't reply. She just took Claire's hand and held it. That night, Claire didn't cry for the laptop or the car or the betrayal. She cried for the memory of a mother who maybe never existed the way she remembered her. The first morning in Lena's spare room smelled like lavender and fresh paint. Claire woke up to sunlight slanting through gauzy curtains, casting soft lines on the hardwood floor. It was quiet, but not the kind of silence she had once feared. This was intentional. A pause between movements. A breath drawn before the next page turned. Lena, her former colleague from the graphic design firm, had offered her a room without hesitation. "I've got a guest space and a lease I'm ready to break," Lena said with a shrug. "It's not charity, it's solidarity." Claire moved in 2 days later, leaving Rachel's apartment with gratitude, but also with clarity she needed her own beginning. The new place was small, just 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and windows that faced west. But to Claire, it felt like possibility wrapped in drywall. The first thing she did after unpacking her clothes was hang a painting. It was a simple canvas she had bought at a street fair years ago, a deep blue ocean under a gray sky, a single sailboat in the center. She had kept it hidden in a box for a long time, telling herself she didn't have the right walls yet. Now it hung in the hallway just outside her bedroom. Her first act of ownership, her first piece of home. That week, Claire signed her own lease. No co-signers, no emergency contacts linked to her family. Just her name clean and firm at the bottom of the page. She opened a new checking account at a local credit union, got a new phone plan, a new number, registered for a P.O. box, everything carefully designed to create distance legally, emotionally, practically. Then she filed the paperwork for a restraining order. The court clerk didn't flinch at her explanation: unauthorized financial access, attempted digital fraud, property theft, in-person threats. The paper trail was thorough. "Most people don't bring receipts," the clerk said, almost impressed. "You did your homework," Claire nodded. "I don't want revenge. I just want safety." She received a temporary protective order 2 weeks later. It wasn't armor, but it was a start. One night while organizing her files, Claire found a note Eli had written her the week she moved out. "They never knew what they had until you walked out the door. I'm proud of you. Keep going. I'm right here." She folded it carefully and slid it into a drawer, not out of avoidance but preservation. She wasn't ready to reach back yet, but she would someday. Maybe. Lena popped her head into the room later that night. "You know, she said you could probably get that promotion now. You've already been doing half the creative director's job." Claire smiled faintly. "I was thinking about applying." "You should," Lena said. "And while you're at it, maybe hang another painting." Claire laughed. It felt easy, unforced. The days passed with gentle rhythm. Work tea evening walks through the quiet streets near her building. She began writing again, small journal entries, then longer thoughts, sometimes poems, sometimes lists. "Things I am reclaiming: my mornings, my money, my time, my voice, my name." She cooked for herself, not just for sustenance but for pleasure. She added herbs to pasta, browned garlic and olive oil, roasted vegetables with care. She stopped apologizing for the quiet joys of solitude. One afternoon she stood in the kitchen and realized no one was going to burst in and tell her she was wasting time. No one was going to demand her energy or her bank account. She was free. And freedom, she'd learned, didn't always arrive like a revolution. Sometimes it came on a Tuesday with fresh basil and open windows. Claire knew healing wasn't linear. She still startled when unknown numbers called her phone. Still had dreams where she was back at the dinner table, expected to be silent. But now she woke from them and knew it wasn't her reality anymore. She had boundaries, she had breath, and she had begun. The call came just after dawn. Claire was sitting at the small kitchen table, steam rising from a chipped mug in her hands, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Eli. Her breath caught not in fear, but in recognition. She hadn't heard from him in weeks. The last text had been short, just a heart emoji and the words, "Still here." She hadn't pushed for more. She answered. There was a pause, then a quiet voice, lower than she remembered, but still unmistakably his. Claire. "Hi," she said softly. "I turned 18 today," Eli said. "I'm legal. He can't stop me anymore. And I'm ready." Claire stood up slowly, the weight of his words settling into her bones. "Where are you?" "Outside," he said. "Your building." She rushed to the window, and there he was, standing alone on the sidewalk, hoodie zipped up, a worn backpack slung over his shoulder, eyes searching the windows like a boy asking permission to grow. Claire opened the door before he could knock. Eli looked up, and for a long moment they didn't speak. Then Claire stepped forward, arms open, and Eli collapsed into them. He didn't cry, not at first, but she felt the way he held on, as if the past few years had taught him that touch could be conditional. "I'm here," she whispered into his hair. "You made it." They stayed like that for a long time, the morning sun slowly climbing behind them. Lena cleared out her spare room without being asked. "He can stay here until you get him set up," she said, setting fresh sheets on the bed. "Thank you," Claire murmured. "Really?" "Family isn't who you're born with," Lena replied. "It's who stands beside you." Claire turned to Eli, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands clenched in his lap. "I can't go back," he said. "Even if he asks, even if she cries, I just can't." "You don't have to," Claire said. "Not ever." Over the next few days, she helped him apply for community college, the same one she had attended years ago before taking her job in design. She walked him through the forms, helped him apply for grants, and paid the enrollment fees herself. When he got accepted, they celebrated with takeout Thai food and a single cupcake with a candle stuck in the center. Eli laughed when she made him blow it out. "I didn't wish for anything," he said, grinning. "Then wish now," she told him. He looked around at her, at the painting in the hallway, at the slice of life that had become their new normal. "I wish this lasts," he said. Claire didn't reply. She just reached over and held his hand. 2 weeks later, they toured the campus. Claire insisted on renting him a dorm room even though he said he could commute. "You need your own space," she said. "You've never had that. Let this be your beginning." "I don't want to take too much from you," Eli replied. "You're not taking," Claire said gently. "You're growing. That's different." He didn't argue again. On the day he moved into the dorm, Claire helped him unpack. She made his bed with hospital corners, placed a sticky note inside one of his textbooks that read, "Proud of you. Always." As she turned to leave, he stopped her. "Claire." She turned. He stepped forward and hugged her again, tighter this time, more certain. "You saved me," he whispered. "I just didn't know it until now." Claire closed her eyes, letting his words wrap around the parts of her still healing. "No," she said softly. "We saved each other." That night, Claire walked home beneath a lavender sky. She thought of the girl she'd been quiet, burdened, unseen. Then she thought of the woman she'd become, grounded, steady, a safe harbor for others, and finally for herself. Some families are inherited, but the best ones are built choice by choice, moment by moment, hand by outstretched hand. And in that, Claire knew she and Eli were home. The letter came on a Tuesday. Claire recognized the handwriting before she even opened the mailbox, looping pressed hard into the paper, like the pen had been wielded more like a weapon than a tool. Susan's handwriting. She stood on the front steps of her apartment for a long moment, envelope in hand. The ink was smudged where fingers had held it too tightly. It smelled faintly of lavender soap, her mother's brand. Claire didn't open it. She walked inside, slipped off her coat, and placed the envelope on the mantel. Then she poured herself tea, finished answering a few work emails, and went about her evening with deliberate calm. She didn't need to read it to know what it said. The unraveling had already begun. Walter had lost another job, this time at a hardware store, fired for shouting at a customer over a return policy. Susan had called Rachel first, hoping to reach Claire indirectly, but Rachel didn't answer. After that, Susan resorted to what she knew best, guilt cloaked in ink. Claire heard the rest through a former neighbor's Facebook post, how the house had finally been foreclosed, how Susan had been seen crying on the porch, shouting into a phone. No one was answering. But Claire didn't call back. Not out of cruelty, not even anger, just clarity. She had built her peace, and she wouldn't trade it for recycled pain wrapped in apology-shaped manipulation. That evening, as the sky turned violet and the wind picked up, Claire lit a fire in the living room's small hearth. She stood before the flames, the envelope still unopened in her hands. Eli sat nearby, flipping through a course catalog. He looked up when he saw her hesitate. "Is it from them?" he asked. Claire nodded. He didn't ask what it said. He didn't need to. "They want you to feel responsible," he said. "But you're not." She didn't reply. She simply walked to the fire and let the envelope slip through her fingers. It curled and blackened instantly, the edges folding inward like wings drawn to ash. The flames ate the paper hungrily. No ceremony, no pause. Just release. Claire sat back on the couch, tucking her feet beneath her. She felt no triumph, no weight lifted, just space. For years she had clung to every note, every scrap of attention her parents offered, afraid that if she let go, she'd be erasing something vital. But now she knew the truth. Not every story needs closure. Some doors must remain shut, not because they're locked, but because what's behind them is no longer welcome. The wind howled a little louder outside, but the room remained warm. Claire picked up a pen and turned to her journal. She didn't write about the letter. She didn't even mention Walter or Susan. Instead, she wrote about the painting in the hallway, the way the light hit the water in it just right at dusk, the softness of silence when it was chosen, not forced, the way her brother laughed, now full and unafraid. Then she underlined one sentence twice. Peace is the absence of permission for pain to return. The river shimmered gold beneath the falling sun. Claire and Eli sat on a worn wooden bench along the embankment jackets, zipped against the crisp dusk breeze. The city hummed behind them, but out here it was quiet, just the sound of water wind and the occasional gull slicing across the sky. Claire held a thermos between her hands. It was warm, filled with cinnamon tea. Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the ripples flicker like candlelight across the surface. They hadn't spoken much since they sat down. They didn't need to. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was chosen. Safe. Claire looked over at her brother and gently slid her hand over his. He didn't flinch. He just smiled softly, the way he used to when they were small, hiding under blankets during their parents' arguments, whispering stories into the dark to feel less alone. "You okay?" she asked. Eli nodded. "Better every day." She looked back at the water. So were they. In another life, this moment might have been impossible. She remembered the girl she used to be, shoulders always tensed, eyes scanning for approval, for permission to exhale. She had once measured her worth in utility, her love in sacrifice. And when neither was enough, she folded further inward. But not anymore. Claire took a slow breath, the kind that fills your lungs all the way down to your spine. Then quietly, she let herself speak the truth she'd never dared to say out loud. "We were the children who endured." Eli turned his gaze steady. Now she continued, "We're the survivors." A gust of wind swept across the riverbank, tugging at their hair, their sleeves, their past. Claire didn't chase it. Later back at home, she stood by the painting in the hallway, the ocean and sky, the solitary sailboat. It didn't look lonely anymore. It looked brave. She reached up and straightened it ever so slightly. The painting was hers. The apartment was hers. The peace was hers. And she would never apologize for it. That night she wrote again in her journal. "Freedom didn't arrive all at once," she scribbled. "It began the moment I said no. No more silence. No more shrinking. No more carrying everything and calling it love." She paused, then added, "You don't owe anyone your pain just because they share your blood." The fire crackled softly nearby. Eli was asleep on the couch, a book open on his chest. Claire tucked a blanket over him before heading to bed. Sometimes she still thought of her parents. not with hatred, but with distance. She wondered if they blamed her, if they saw her absence as cruelty, rebellion, betrayal. Maybe they did, but that was no longer her concern. She had built something real now, something steady, a life stitched together not from obligation, but from authenticity. Weeks later, Claire stood at the edge of a local college campus, watching Eli pick up his student ID. He grinned when he saw the picture. "I look grown," he said. "You are," she replied. He laughed. "Well, sort of." Claire reached out and tugged at his backpack strap playfully. "You're exactly where you're meant to be." They walked back to the car in companionable silence. One evening, Claire posted a single message on a forum for women navigating family estrangement. No names, no details, just a question. If you've had to walk away from people who hurt you, even family, would you ever go back? Or would you choose the new road you built alone? There were dozens of replies. Some said they went back and regretted it. Others said they never did and felt peace for the first time in their lives. A few admitted they didn't know what they would do, only that they were tired of bleeding for people who never noticed the wound. Claire didn't reply to any of them. She just closed her laptop and sat back, letting the stories wash over her like rain on dry soil. She didn't need an answer that day. She already had one. Because healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like a door that stays shut. Sometimes it looks like a painting on a quiet wall. Sometimes it looks like two siblings sitting by the river holding hands, breathing in the sun as it sets on everything they've survived.